Okay, buenas tardes, amigos, amigues. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If we could just take our seats, we'll kick off here. Just a quick note, maybe those of you maybe have already figured it out, but obviously because we had to rearrange the room since you were there were some bags and luggage that we moved to that side of the room, just in case you were looking for it. That's over there. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch, and we're really pleased to have, sorry I had to cut it short, but we think it was for very good reason, and we have some great keynote speakers here, one of whom is actually on the way, Mexico traffic, it's to be expected, but so we'll have Federico Gutierrez join us on stage during the upcoming presentation, and we'll introduce him kind of more properly afterwards. So again, we've got some great government representation here, and we'll then, after this, go straight into the round table discussion, the think tanks. Don't necessarily worry, I suppose, if you're not sat at the table that you intend to be at, you can always switch afterwards as such, but we will move straight into that and do coffee later. Okay, I mean, the last 2 days we've heard a lot, obviously, about infrastructure. We've heard a lot about different investment projects, but also capacity and bottlenecks. A lot about intermodal, multimodal, and the importance of that for Mexico, for exports, for imports, and for the overall network. So that's why it's really fantastic that we've been able to have join us today Dr. David Carrillo Morillo, who's the Director General for Multimodal Corridors and Logistics from the Ministry of Communication and Transportation. David has had quite a long career already with the ministry. Told us over at lunch he actually started doing some consulting at 19, I believe, before doing studies and his PhD. He studied in many European countries, different transport networks, so he has quite a global perspective and understanding of logistics, and is now working on some very interesting projects to do with connecting multimodal corridors and improving links, which I'm sure he will tell us more about. So we'll have a presentation from David, as I mentioned, and then we will then hear from Federico Gutierrez, who is from the National Infrastructure Fund afterwards. So, David?
So, thank you very much for inviting me to this Automotive Logistics conference. I will present in Spanish because I didn't know it was for speaking in English. So then, but then I can answer in Spanish, English, doesn't matter. Bueno, espero que hayan disfrutado.
Contestar en inglés o en español como ustedes gusten. I hope you had a nice lunch. I know we have now going through digestion. I'll try to keep you awake during the presentation. Above all, I want to share with you the logistic and multimodal corridors for SCT, the Mexican Department of Transportation, SCT, this with the rail multimodal network. Sometimes I wonder why. There are some questions I cannot answer. I think the rail transportation consolidates more cargo, and now it's been localized in the country. I think that's the reason why. Now, regarding the bylaws for rail transportation services, was published 2 days ago. There was this was already been published in December, and now this rail will be separated or a separate entity or agency from SCT. SCT. Even though this is the rail agency, now we are working on those plans, and we'll see how we can be the technical arm of the SCT ministry to improve railroad service. Good news, short rails which are not used by concessionaires at present will now be taken again by the state, and they will be a call for bids so that they are used. There is a good market here, knowing all the companies that will be here from the automotive industry, and of course needs massive transportation available for them. I would like to start my presentation by saying where we are standing now, how we are viewed globally, and how we are scored. The logistic performance index from the World Bank in 1214 gives us one is lower, 5 is the highest. Here we are a developing country, therefore this is the score we got from a scale from 1 to 5, and there is a lot to improve. Personally, I have my questions to know how they come up with this index. This is based on experts. We got 3.13. The logistic experts do the scoring, but I don't know who are the experts. Even my dad knows about logistics, but he's a public accountant. So this is very diversified. Everybody knows about logistics, and that's why it's so difficult, because there are scores on different scores that we don't know what they mean. This shows we are in 50 out of we rank 44 in 2012. We moved from 50 to 45, but the thing is that 5 countries were added. We were 100, we are now ranking number 50 out of 160 countries. Now, regarding the ranking of infrastructure and world competitive according to the World Economic Forum, we are ranking 41, and the score is 4.2, where 1 is the lowest and 7 very high for the infrastructure quality index. So based on this, we were working on the national infrastructure development plan. How are we doing in roads, highways? The main highways haven't connected. I say this because we have always been lagging behind because of geographical situations and issues in the country. The country, obviously, the mountain, the western mountain range and the southern area make it difficult to build highways. This is not a flat country, as you may think, or as what they have showed us in school. Countries like Germany, they have a grid and they have very good road infrastructure, but they do not have the geography we have here. A very clear example, and you have known this, Mazatlan, Durango, which has been the most expensive highway in the history, because we had to reduce the distance, and this was shortened, as the previous term said. We took the backbone out of the devil, as he said. The backbone devil is the upper highway on the upper road in the mountain range, which looks like a spine or a backbone. Now, Mazatlan is not a high port, and Durango is not a logistic producer. However, this type of infrastructure helps us to trigger the economic logistic potential they have. If you see during the flows that we have in Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas ports, a third option with the road, the highway, we can open a connection to Durango, which is virgin in terms of urban development, and there is still space to install more infrastructure. This is also the case of Durango, as we will see later on. There was also a rail peripheric. I don't know if you knew about this, and now they're opening logistic center to host these flows in the future. The rail terminal was moved, now it is located on the airport side. All the conditions are given by the country government in this regard. Now we have the highway. They planned also to have rail, but as you know, transportation solutions are to meet a specific problem. And if we don't still have enough load and to plan a rail where a highway is so expensive, well, this is causing hesitation, and we are trying to find a better way to invest in the country, looking for a more productive alternative instead of that rail. Now, here, the main troncal axis, what is the policy now? We used to have before a system which was centralized and a federal system. Everything had to go through Mexico City, where you have this kind of star. Now we have the Northern Economic Corridor, the corridors that go from Altamira through Manzanillo, and now we see the importance the southern part of the country also has. In regards rail transportation, you can see in red you have Kansas City, southern Mexico, which is connected with Kansas City, obviously one of the main rail hubs in the US, and also Manzanillo through Ferromex, which company which connects with the northern part of the country. We see here the rail passings, even though very much used. One in Tijuana, one in Mexicali, a small passing, Nogales, Juarez, Ojinaga, Ciudad Acuña, Piedras Negras, Nuevo Laredo, and Matamoros, Bronzeville, the crossing. This one, the last one, is the one which has been recently opened. They're finishing the facilities and the rail passing, which is managed by a bilateral company of the US and the Mexican government. They are still trying to harmonize in order to expedite the customs review in these points. The problem with customs points is they review different things. In Mexico, they're more focused on the fiscal part, and the US pay more attention to the security part. We need to harmonize that. It is important to say, because here we know Manzanillo, Lázaro Cárdenas, the main parts, and then we can have trains that allow us to split the cargo going to the central part of Mexico, an important consumer in the US. This way we can lower the logistics costs for both countries, and this supports us as well, as you know very well, about the saturation of the port because of LA and Long Beach strike, and Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas are working with the inputs that are arriving from Asia. But also I must say that basically Altamira, Tampico and Veracruz ports keep on taking care of flow from South America, which is important for the industry, as well as coming from Europe. These companies, European car companies, will receive from Antwerp or from other parts of Europe cars arriving from Europe and go through Veracruz. This is the topic of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, which are served by massive transportation. Let me finish by saying about Ferrosur in yellow. Right now, that's part of Mexico Group, as well as Ferromex. They have a consolidation, and they also have the main connections in Veracruz, Puebla, where there are important car automotive industries, and then we also have Chiapas Mayab and other smaller ones. The Tehuantepec Isthmus Rail, it was there. Hurricane 2005, the government is investing to speed up the rail and to avoid the problems, problems with the crossing points, security. This train is called the Beast. By increasing the speed, we will eliminate some of those problems, and it will be more efficient. Now, regarding sea transportation, we have enough ports, more than enough. We have coastlines on both oceans, and I can say just the main ones that could be more important for automotive industry: Lázaro Cárdenas, Manzanillo, and Veracruz. Now Tampico is just starting, basically Altamira. Tampico is more for oil, the oil industry. The others are for other types of industry which are not so much focused, such as the case of mining industry, white cement transported on this side, but that is for another and a different industry. Well, air transportation also in airports. We have many airports. We are trying to open those connections to have the so-called business clusters that, more than anything, are related to airports. This is an important part. Some car parts are also transported by air, depending on the industry and the sector, in particular for the car industry. Obviously, we know these are high price car parts that can afford this transportation. We are also paying attention to airports. An example is Guadalajara City Airport with WTC Confianza Company. They bring car parts for Honda, not car parts, but basically for motorcycles, not for cars, but motorcycles. This is another topic I like to share, and we want you to know that we are trying to understand that within the government, basically we see that all foreign trade and basically automotive logistics requires foreign trade. So we have to focus on logistics. A simple thing that may come from another country, this which could be seen as a barrier, but it cuts the flow of goods from the point of origin, which can be abroad, and then there is a cargo transfer, a final transfer, and then going to the end destination, to the end, the point of sale. These segments we are more concerned with, where there can be more investment. In ports, we have invested. Mexico is aware of the crossing points and also of the ports. We are focusing on areas such as Veracruz, where there is more activity. Also, there is focus in Lázaro Cárdenas, and they are extending the infrastructure in Manzanillo. Altamira Port has also a multi-use terminal, which is outside of the port to improve its connectivity. Therefore, here we have to see the other side. If it is originated here, as we will see later, we also have to take into account the last mile connection and the main segment to come out with the products and bring them out of the country to the rest of the world. This is another map about the light vehicle cluster. There may be some of them missing. Help me correct this in order to improve my presentation. But we have identified Ford, GM, Chrysler, Fiat, BMW, that will has been installed, Kia, Honda, Mazda, Audi, Nissan, Toyota, and I think that's it. The ones missing to be located with plans, Mitsubishi, with Toyota Terminal, Infinity, and Mercedes-Benz. These are the ones that we know, and they have not determined their location yet. BMW, I believe, recently announced it will be settled in San Luis Potosí SLP. Correct me if I am wrong, but you are the experts, so I will help. I will thank you for your help in that regard. Regarding heavy vehicles, Kenworth, Freightliner, Mercedes-Benz, International Cummins, Hino Motors, Dyna, Grand Motors, and Suzu, Volvo, MAN, where they are located, and Scandia. As the secretary said, the car cluster gives vitality to the economy and has helped us to grow the Mexican economy. Therefore, we are in the government focusing on this. As part of the National Infrastructure Plan, there are improvement to highways, new rail bypasses, extension of ports, air cargo terminals specialized in cargo. In the new airport for Mexico City, there will be new specific runways for cargo. Also logistic platforms, as I will talk about, and this has to do with logistics again, for distribution with certain type of specificity, industrial parks, and the rail passes. As I said, just for massive transportation in the case of cargo, some of the President Peña's commitments are more than 150 of the commitments are in the hands of SCT. As part of rails, the cargo railroads, as stipulated, is the short section, Aguascalientes, Guadalajara section, and Castillo section to have connectivity with the northern part in the country in an expedited manner. This project has 500 kilometers to go through highway, to go to Irapuato to exchange and go to Encarnacion region. The project here, has been planned for more than 20 years, and it is planned that this, which took 27 hours, will now take only 3 hours for that very same travel. Now, change of route for rail in Manzanillo. A gas station was converted in order to allow to place the highway connecting with Manzanillo and Guadalajara and Colima. This route was changed, the rail route was changed, a new 60-meter width canal to more than 600 meters wide canal is determined in Coyutlán, which is near Manzanillo port, to have a gas reconversion plant to generate the energy needed for Colima. This allows to better connect with Manzanillo, the one having more growth at present. Number one in number of containers, and this also goes through a viaduct on top of a rail viaduct on top of the lagoon very fast. Still, we need to do the portal to connect that viaduct with the current port. This is being conducted, this tunnel is being made to finish the works and to have a direct connection with the port. This will extend the operational and dynamic capacity of the port. The Celaya rail bypass, I mentioned before, is very large, one of the rail hearts of Mexico, where we have Kansas City and Ferromex lines cross. For both, this is kind of a crossing in the central part of the town, which causes problems for cargo and inhabitants. Now they're having a bypass around the city. Ferromex company is going through the south part, and Kansas City rail going to the eastern part around the city. Finally, the Coatzacoalcos rail bypass. The Coatzacoalcos has a connection which is saturated. They are not connected with the southern part of Coatzacoalcos city. Now they are opening and they are improving the rail services in order to also handle cargo from the southeast and to also handle it by rail. All this goes on a bridge, and this causes saturation. Now that we are improving, we are conducting the studies and we are to implement that.
And finally, let me tell you about the National System of Logistic Platforms, which is a project undertaken by the Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Communication of Transports, along with an International Development Bank. First, it was to identify how we were logistic-wise in infrastructure, the services we need to work, which markets are located and where, how can we improve the logistic territorial ordering, where do we need more land for logistic infrastructure, and where can this be implemented. The result, after a hard work of collection of information that has taken more than 2 years, was this map. This is a master plan that locates different structures per vocation. I think that you might be interested in the cluster logistic platform for the automotive sector, which are the red dots. And first we can see locations as Hermosillo, Guadalajara, and the Bajío, Silao, in Guanajuato, which are those that we should facilitate in order to have a vision as a Ministry of Communication and Transports to communicate cargo and not center our efforts in passengers. This is my presentation. Thank you for your invitation, and please help me update my cluster maps. Thank you.
Gracias, David. I'm sure many in the room are willing to help you update that as long as you give them copies of all the information that they're interested in as well. Thank you for updating us on some of those projects and on some of what's happening in the Ministry for Communication and Transportation relative to rail and logistics. We'll take questions, as I mentioned, at the end, but in true automotive logistics fashion, we had the just-in-time arrival of our second speaker, Federico Gutierrez, who is the Subdirector of Roads and Project Evaluation from the National Infrastructure Fund, which helps support investment in infrastructure and helps to facilitate public and private partnerships. So I'd now like to invite Federico.
Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to apologize by not being able of being here yesterday. There was a new appointment of our new director of Banobras, and with the visit of the secretary at our institutions, we were requested. I will present the National Infrastructure Fund as an instrument for the development of infrastructure. What we can say pertaining the fund is that it was created by the federal government on February 2008 through a presidential decree, and in April 2008 Banobras was designated as trustee of this trust that gathered two sources of wealth, one coming from the infrastructure trust and another trust for a road network that I will explain encompasses 50 projects of roads and bridges managed by the trust created for this purpose, called FARAC and FINFA, were merged, and through this merger, a trust, which is the network, we have more liquefied resources, around 40 billion pesos in those years, gave us the possibility to create this tool, which main purpose is to promote the development and construction of new infrastructure in our country to a specific mechanism that I will explain throughout my presentation in what we call public and private associations. This is an instrument so that other from the expenditure federal budget, there is the option, the possibility to develop infrastructure in 8 or 9 sectors that I will mention, with the creation of public and private association schemes and with other instruments that I will explain. The objectives of this national fund is, as I said, to support the development of infrastructure, specifically that under the framework of our National Development Plan and specifically as a tool of the National Infrastructure Plan. An important element is to attract private investment for infrastructure projects, and mainly this is done through licenses from the federal, state, and even municipal governments in some projects in order to develop certain type of infrastructure in the 8 or 9 sectors that I will explain, to assume risks that the market is not willing to take on. Usually, if an infrastructure developer or licensor of a project finds the need to be funded, commercial banking, development banks, perhaps they are not in the conditions to assume some risks that the funding, because of its nature, because of its reason for creation, can assume and take these risks. Amongst the products that we manage, we have developed a new market, a new instrument in the financial market for Mexico, not for countries as some like yours, where the subordinated debt is a common funding scheme. We don't have available that in Mexico. The only authority that grants this is the National Infrastructure Fund to support projects with a corporate profitability, but also with a low financial profitability, meaning because of a forecast for demand and revenue doesn't have a return of market to the licensor, private licensor, it is evident that the sole possibility is to reduce the amount of investment through subventions, which is one of the instruments used by this National Infrastructure Fund. So the idea here is to make projects profitable through these instruments in order to promote participation of private investors, facilitate access to long-term financing to infrastructure projects. Until recently, in the banking market, you could find funding from 7, 8, 10-year terms if we were lucky. And these terms didn't match terms for licenses, which are up to 30 years, and with the new law of public and private association could take longer, up to 40 years. And in these projects with a 7-year term funding, there was a mismatch. So we tried to correct this instrument, inviting private investors and trying to find the participation from the stock market to fund in longer terms. As I mentioned, the FONADIN is part of the Infrastructure National Program under our National Development Plan, Chapter 4, that is about to have a prosperous Mexico, where goals and objectives established by our National Development Plan have to do with a sustainable economic growth, a stable economy, equal opportunities amongst the different stakeholders, proper infrastructure. Here we have strategic inputs, competitiveness, and so on. There is a series of objectives that you can see in our development plan, and in particular the National Infrastructure Program that aims to the completion of these objectives. This is a financial tool in order to withstand and support objectives from the National Program for Infrastructure. This program, Infrastructure National Program, as my colleague from the Secretary of Communication and Transports comprehends a series of objectives, 743 projects, out of which 262, as you can see, are located for energy, electricity, and Petróleos Mexicanos. In the case for communications and transport, which is the next in priority in the program, it includes 223 different projects, and other sectors follow as water, health, hospitals, tourism, and so on. And it all encompasses a total of 743 projects that in monetary terms it represents more than 7 billion pesos, and in dollars it would be $596.2 million, out of which we want $220 million come from private investment. Which are the sectors eligible for the National Infrastructure Program? The most important, because of its nature, have been roads, well, there is a link containing the list of highways and roads included in what could be eligible for funding in the National Infrastructure Program. There is a list of projects that are identified as possible public-private associations. Also, we have ports, airports, and the most relevant is the construction of the new Mexico City airport, which is being supported by the National Infrastructure Fund in this stage where all the studies are being conducted. Railroads, urban transportation. Here also it is a priority that in all cities of certain size of more than 500,000 people, we might have a realignment of transport through some icon like rapid bus system that has been promoted in Latin American countries as Brazil and Colombia. Mexico, as you can see, our Insurgentes Avenue is a clear example of this system. Environment, tourism, water, and solid waste treatment is another priority in the National Infrastructure Fund. These are smaller projects that have to do with efforts conducted by municipal entities in order to complete these projects. And the last chapter where we are, and this is not a sector, but in the private equity funds, we have invested in 9 investment funds of private capital that have established as a goal or objectives to be able to invest capital in Mexico, and a source of resources is the National Infrastructure Fund. Eligibility criteria, so a project can be funded by our National Infrastructure Fund. Well, there are several, but the top 3 are: first, that they are projects developed through public and private associations. This means that they should be concessions granted through service level agreements by the federal government, state and municipal governments as well, to private licensors that can build these projects and exploit this service. They should be assigned through public bids or tenders, because we have the mandate to comply with Article 74 constitutional that deals with transparency. And 3, they should be projects with their own source of payment, meaning that a project, just to say an example, a road, a toll-free road, that income is not conceived, it wouldn't be a subject of funding through FONADIN. So one, they have to have their own source of payment. They have to be granted through public bids. And three, there should be a concession scheme where the government and the private party have an association scheme. These are the products from the FONADIN. We have two sections. One is non-recoverable supports that have two possibilities. One, there are contributions to governments in all three levels to cover the expense of public works required for such a project. As an example, in the case of rapid bus systems, there is some infrastructure that has to be developed by governments under a public works scheme that cannot be transferred to the private party concession because this project would not be funded. This is about liability or an obligation of the government to develop a specific and basic infrastructure. And by this I mean section of lanes, concrete or asphalt lanes, signaling, and everything that is part of the government obligations. And on the other side, subventions. We can provide contributions for studies and projects. In the case of subventions is, as I said earlier, if a project has a projected flow and this provides 2-3% ROI to the investor, this will not attract private investment. The only possibility that we have is to reduce the amount of investment to the private party, and with this we include subventions to the degree that the amount of investment is reduced, so profitability for the private party would be a market profitability. This is done for the preparation of public tenders. And the next stage after licenses have been granted to private investors, the next step is to find a financial closure through banking, stock market funding, or different instruments to complete projects. In this other stage, we can contribute with refundable resources. In this case, we have the possibility for contribution through equity, that although this can go straight to projects, we can do it through private equity funds. And as I said, we have resources in 8 or 9 funds that have been investing in infrastructure projects, because this is the way our rules set the conditions to take part of these private equity funds. And also the subordinate debt. This is a new market that needed development before the funding needs of our country. In this case, the idea is not to compete with retail banking the other way around. We want to favor with these subordinate debt schemes and guarantees the participation of the banking institutions. They require some indexes of coverage. We also planted subordinate contingency lines or guarantees, and the debt instruments may also have the possibility to be guaranteed by the FONADIN. And the next part, which are loans that can be granted to government entities in order to conduct studies. Currently, we are working on some important studies, and they are soon to be funded by the National Infrastructure Fund. This table explains what I've just mentioned: subventions, support. The preparation stage for projects for public bids. Once they are granted through subordinate debts, we can support construction stages, or with contingency credit lines, we can support ramp up and completion of projects. And on the other side, the idea is that funding with this type of supports, with these instruments, will cover for these risks that oftentimes the market doesn't assume, after the construction stage, that when risks may be complicated, because they represent backwardness, overruns, changes in executive project, which are common, delays in the release of the right of way, not be able to complete funding proceeding, environmental risks, even archaeological risks. And when the ramp up stage is a risk involved traffic, tariffs, elasticity, and how the project will respond to that are also risks elements that may be covered by the National Infrastructure Fund. And other risks in the growth and consolidation stage are those related to stability revenue in the long term, operation expenses, conservation expenses, and risks associated to long term in all projects. This is the network. As I said, this fund, aside from these supports, it is a licensor that manages 50 projects, out of which 51 projects. And from these 46 are roads, 37 in operation, 9 in construction, work in progress, 5 bridges, 4 in operation, 1 in construction, representing a total of 4,000 kilometers. Is approximately half our highway network in terms of licensed highways. And finally, to give you an idea of our accomplishments, Fonadin has supported a total of 95 projects with investments and studies, accounting for more than $8 billion, and this has helped the promotion of investment of close to $27 billion. We have a multiplier of 3.6, 3.7. This is what we have granted, the summation, the accrued. How this has been distributed through projects or sectors: we have supported 65%. Our resources have been for the construction of new roads. Another item is urban transportation, representing 9% of our support. Also water and solid waste treatment, 9%, and other sectors, the remaining. And finally, the distribution between non-refundable and refundable: 44% of our funds granted are for non-refundable. As I said, they are contributions or subventions for project completion. And with this, I finish my presentation. Once again, I thank you, and again, I apologize by not being here yesterday. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gutierrez, and I'm sure we all heartily accept your apologies, and thank you for coming in, today and giving us your time. Thanks again also to both of our panelists for coming. I think that was really useful, valuable information. I don't want to take too much time away from the think tanks and round tables. We still want to leave a reasonable amount of time for that, but whilst we have these gentlemen representing government, it would be obviously useful to pose questions to them. So without anybody from the audience like to, we have a question right in the back. The microphone coming to you. Just say your name and company, please.
Sí, buenas tardes, Roberto Zavala, WWL México. Es un par de preguntas para David.
WL Mexico, I have a couple of questions for David, particularly regarding rail accesses as an example. That from Altamira, where there is an important challenge in the Tamazopo and Altamira section that restricts access from the center of the country. You need to go up all the way to Monterrey and then go down. Do you have any update? Is there an approach, a project regarding? And the other one is the Mayab line. Before the hurricane, the railroad reached all the way to Merida, and there was a good corridor for domestic market. Is there some project to know where this line will be working again in operation? Well, regarding Altamira Tampico is a whole topic by itself because each one of the two licensors, Ferromex and Kansas City, arrived at both ports. The problem here is the right of way. There is a connection between these two ports in order to provide service. The issue is the right of way because, and I think you should be familiar with this, it is an agreement between private parties because they both are licensors. So the problem is that when railroad companies were private, is that Ferrocarriles Nacionales was reducing its level of service, thus the volume transported and ground transportation was increased. So at that point, the government decided to invite the private sector to invest. As you know, this infrastructure is costly, is one of the most expensive infrastructures. Even I am a professor and I say my students, although steel is the best quality, is not that much the steel, but the land movement in order to reach the necessary slope. So that is why so expensive. So an exclusivity period was granted so they could recover their investment because yearly companies invest around 10% of their profit as minimum. They invest even more, certainly because their investments are for the long term. What we had tried to do is to improve this relationship of right-of-ways, and what you say from Altamira, Kansas connection is not for the south of the country. Cargo is consolidated, taken to Monterrey, and then it goes down. So the logistic operator, if the price is too high to use the rail, so this may lead to a cost reduction in warehousing, and you negotiate these and the transportation. The other thing is you could change the logistic chain and go to a lower or southern port as Veracruz. And you have in Santa Fe the connection of Ferrosur with Kansas, which are the two companies that travel to the center of our country, but then you would need to negotiate at a global level because the railroad or the ground transportation are not related to sea transport. This is a problem. Exclusivity terms are because they were around 18 or 20 years, and this was back in 1997. So by the year 2017, this will be completed. So the secretary, or this is my interpretation of the decree of representatives, they will be able to renegotiate when this exclusivity term is completed, and with this the right of way. As for the Chiapas Mayab, This has been a whole issue because of the hurricane. The damage of the hurricane, it raised all the tracks and more than 18 bridges collapsed. So we did pre-repairs and temporary repairs in order to continue provision of service. With this new presidential administration, we are investing huge amounts of money to rebuild this in order to provide service to the Yucatan Peninsula, and it includes diesel for power generation, cement for public works, and this issue is exogenous to the purposes of the government because, as you know, we are not doing so great. We are still under $70 per barrel of oil, and the problem is for next year that between 25 and 30% of our budget comes from the oil revenue. So we will have monetary constraints, and we would need to struggle to complete projects. We are aware that we should support this sector, but we're working on it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you for that. We have another question. We have two in the front here. We'll start at this table and then we'll move there.
Muy buenas tardes, Stuart McGillivray en representación de Toyota. Mi duda es acerca de...
Mr. Gurria, on behalf of Toyota, how do you make the decisions? Like any other government, the government of Mexico has limited resources. Priorities are many. When you make a decision, what is the investment and what is the activity that will be a priority? What is it like? Is there a forum where the private sector can express their interest in a specific project? There is this mechanism from previous administrations and which has paid off and been successful. The National Infrastructure Program. This is derived from the National Development Program. This one for infrastructure is done with all the ministries of the government participate in that National Infrastructure Program, together with all the agencies and decentralized agencies with the Treasury Department of Mexico. For this presidential term, we have had open tables for the public to contribute with the National Development Program. This is not the only tool. As we said before, when the different associations, guilds and groups get close to SCT, the Ministry of Transport, the guilds or associations can speak about the interest. Of course, there must be also the interest of the government. The government cannot participate as a private entity, and this is closely related to what we are talking about. Logistics has nothing about public. Logistics is totally private. But when there is a bottleneck in the case of infrastructure, like Federico said, infrastructure, will never be profitable for the government. Therefore, the different chambers of commerce or companies have to get close to the government to close the cycle and to participate also as a concession, or at least to contribute with the knowledge, so there is interest on the part of government to invest there. Also, the social aspect and the social focus is important. For logistics, we need to offer services. Services have to arrive to all inhabitants. That is how that benefit for the society is derived. So get close to the government. Like we said, many people in logistics complain because, yes, effectively, there are still problems in the country in depth that have to be solved, but they do not get close to the government. They do not resort to the government to talk about this. One thing is rumors, word of mouth, and something else, facts. Through rumors, that's how the logistic platform system was created, because us, the government, had to go close to the different guilds, associations, and chambers, and companies interested in order to gather that information. Because in Mexico, I don't know, in some other countries, always this is through rumors, words of mouth, and that is the main hurdle, I think, a lack of communication between the government and the private sector in the field of logistics. And also, perhaps, if I may, to prevent and to avoid this just to become a rumor, just to hear from word of mouth. Now there is a new legal framework in Mexico, the new private-public partnership law, which opens the possibility for unrequested petitions. In the field of logistics, the government has a national infrastructure program. Undoubtedly, it is not encompassing everything which a country may require, and in some topics in particular to make the country more competitive. In the field of logistics, I believe the public-private partnership law opens the possibility to submit unrequested petitions. I believe this is a good pathway where private initiative, private sector has a tool to get close to the government and to submit a project which makes sense and which could receive these types of supports we have talked about. With this, to participate, the private sector can participate to improve the planning tools of the federal government. En el frente pregunta.
Okay, bueno, muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Iván Hernández.
Iván Hernández with Daimler, Freightliner, and Mercedes-Benz. I'll make a couple of corrections for the map. My question has to do with the topic that we have heard about yesterday. It is not a rumor that Mexico will go to produce 3 million vehicles to 5 million vehicles. In the truck sector and bus sector, more than 80,000 units are produced in Mexico, and we will continue with the relocation of suppliers coming into Mexico. So from abroad, the concern and the part of everybody is capacity, and you have shown us some of the plans in place. As we can see, these are works that are being made to keep Mexico competitive, but we also know that in 4 or 5 years into the future, Mexico will be doubling the level of products that are being produced now. My question is similar to my question yesterday. Will we be ready by 2018? This morning we were saying that investment is not becoming a reality as expected. This, in a way, is of concern to us. In this area, the priority of the country has always been the case. Historically, we have seen it. The main mode of transportation in Mexico that has been developed is highways. Perhaps lack of negotiation or facility of negotiation with other massive transportation such as rail. I'm speaking here domestically. This has allowed for a granularization of the cargo. If it was consolidated, it could offer cost reduction for companies and to make Mexico more appealing for investment. You are right in what you say. Investment, just to say, this is not Daimler, but companies like Honda are getting close to the government, and through their initiative we started the Celaya bypass going around the city. So this is the interest of the government with the car company. Also Aguascalientes, Guadalajara, Encarnación, El Salto sections. Those also segments allow a connection directly with Manzanillo Port, and that was because of the initiative of Aguascalientes Nissan plant. When I was there, they told me the efficiency they're looking for the plant, all the company and all the companies together are larger than the city itself. They will be producing, assembling one car every 2 minutes. That's the expected efficiency. That investment is because those car companies got close to the government. Yes, Puebla cluster will also bring something. Now, with OD and VW, there, if these projects, if you go close to the government, because we know there are huge amounts invested by investors. Of course, Mexico government wants to supplement that with public works. That's why we talked about the extension of the canals or channels. We are also working about priorities. Yes, the first variable considered is demand. when there is demand for infrastructure, and that is the number one priority, or establishes the priority for projects. If there is no demand, then projects are done by stages, and that is the case until there is a level of demand. I mean, urban transportation, passenger transportation, ports, the Mexico City airport as well, to consolidate demand and to be able to move it out. That is the number one incentive. Of course, not everything is submitted in the National Infrastructure Plan is achieved, but if, believe me, if there is enough demand to support the service, undoubtedly this will be done as soon as possible. We resolve along the way, because on the social aspect, if there is more demand, if the more demand we take care of, the better off Mexico will be.
Iván, si respondí a tu duda.
Ivan, did I answer your question? I'm sorry, if the microphone is not used, I'm not able to hear. Sorry about that. Just in closing, Veracruz. Yesterday, Veracruz, we were talking about investment plans yesterday, and they expect to be able to have the expansion plans by 2018. But if something happens in the meantime, that will not be done, accomplished. Yes, the variable of doubt always will be there. As I talked about exogenous variables out of the country, we cannot control. But the logistic activity in Veracruz, since I came back, when I was studying abroad, they've been investing for more than 7 years in the logistic zone of Veracruz, and they're conducting studies to have Santa Fe bypass and to produce goods from the city outside by rail. This is increasing, particularly in the case of Veracruz Port. And yes, money is being invested, because the focus for ports will at least to give more infrastructure to these 4 main ports. In all the ports of Mexico, when they reach 60% of saturation, at that time we are already conducting studies so as to start with the extension works.
We'll take one last question, that's right in the back, and then we'll go to the roundtables.
I'm going to make the question in Spanish.
I am with Transdevelopment, Carlos Torreon. I'll speak in Spanish. In this forum, there have been several concerns and conclusions. Number one, production of vehicles in the next 3 or 4 years will be increased in more than 100%, as we saw. Number two, there is a big concern in all the plants and among the attendees that infrastructure in Mexico for rail, ports and highways is saturated in Mexico. It is not sufficient as of today. It has to be improved in the short term, so the expectations are met. Number three, I believe, this is my very personal viewpoint, there is no credibility in the investment plans of the government if they will be complied with in the timing as needed by manufacturing plants. Example, Celaya bypass. That bypass has been under study for many, many years. It started last administration. It was going to be finished by 2020. This is 2014, and the bypass has not been constructed more than 50%, and the most difficult segments are still pending. How can the federal government give certainty to the attendees that these investment plans will be complied with? It is clear that the main investment of the government is for highways. We now know that there are other modes necessary, particularly for longer distance, such as rail and sea transportation. Going back to one of the questions as before, the port of Veracruz, it is expanding, but a very important component is that rail bypass going around. Are you thinking, or will it be finished by 2018? People asked my opinion. If Celaya, which had been planned and the budget was in place, it's taking between 2 and 7 years, how certain can we be that the bypass in Veracruz will be ready? The question is for both of you. How certain can you give us, the attendees, that the government plans will be complied with? And this is not just political issues. And now with the oil prices, that could be a good excuse to say that this cannot be done. In the National Infrastructure Plan, we are covering not only the President's commitments I don't know if I talked about that. The president's commitment is the current president Peña, when he was a candidate, he signed before a public notary public, that what he was going to do in the term. In the National Infrastructure Plan, these commitments by the president are included, and also they are including strategic projects that cannot be left aside. What I can assure you is that at least we have this instruction from the government. Priority is number one, the government commitments. This priority is also for financing. When there is establishment of annual budget, first the president's projects are given priority. In the case of Celaya, also the two rail companies and the local government are involved. The local government and the rail companies say they will invest, and the other part will be given by the federal government. However, when there is no contribution by all four parties, even if the federal government contributes with the money, well, not always can be exercised or used. Why? One thing is the right of way. When there is a state government and offers more than what the federal government can offer, because there are assessments done, because of the land resources are not enough. In the case of Celaya, that is what happened. The release of the right of way has been making everything to be delayed. Not lack of infrastructure, but the lack of management on the part of the state, because there is no land owned by the federal government there. The federal government cannot act directly on the land except for doing it through a municipality or a state. That was the number one problem in Celaya. The commitment that we have and has to be completed before the president's term is over, to comply with these four projects that I was able to show you on the presentation. For cargo rail, the Santa Fe project is a project under study, and there is interest by both rail companies to consolidate that cargo. If there is interest by the rail companies, they invest together with the government through a public-private partnership, and things take place. The problem is when the whole chain of stakeholders is working, if one of them gets stuck, the others cannot be moving, cannot make progress. That's the number one thing. Just like any other project anywhere else in the world, the plan is to complete them. We depend on many things. That certainty will not even was not given by England when they did the canal, because the project goes, the price of the project, or the cost goes up exponentially. That is a hurdle. There is always a planning, but they may not be implemented directly because of the conditions of the soil, because of social issues, because there were many other factors. So it is not so easy for the government to implement the projects, because this is not a dictatorship. If this was a dictatorship, then it would happen what has happened with the countries, and the infrastructure is done, and when they are required in other dictatorships, that's what happened. That's the problem. Technically speaking, that's the problem of being in a democracy. I don't want to just find an excuse to go out of the topic.
Bueno, simplemente para
Just in supplementing what has been said by David, let me add the following. One of the elements that could be a backlog is the lack of availability of financial resources. This is the objective of the National Infrastructure Fund. The National Infrastructure Fund, we have found in several fora that it is an instrument which Mexico has at hand, and very seldom we can find it, or in very few countries we can find something similar, something which is granting private concessionaries, which are an important part of the development of this infrastructure, something what the National Infrastructure Fund can give. Debt, subordinated debt schemes, subsidies, and so on. I think it is easier to find through this plan development banks from other countries with some highly developed instruments to foster these projects and for a longer term. But resources, contributions, subsidies by the federal and state governments, for example, to carry out studies to release the right of way with the fund of resources with which Fonadin fund was born. We have given resources for the government to develop studies to release the right of way, to comply with some additional commitments for other works, and we have also been contributing with resources to make it possible the participation of private investment in the development of this task. In Fonadin, the National Infrastructure Fund, Fonadin, is an alternative to the federal budget, which is provided for by all the government programming. So that Fonadin, the National Infrastructure Fund, has a long life and the funding to finance initiatives in the long term for the different sectors, promoted by the different sectors of the government.
I think we're probably making some changes to the roundtable, which I'll address in a minute. And I know Mr. Murillo has to leave at 3. So, I mean, we can take maybe one more question, actually, if we have it. So let's take the one right in the middle.
Rafael López de Ford Motor Company.
With Ford Motor Company Logistics. Congratulations, David, for the interesting information in your presentation. My question is what Toyota and Chrysler asked you before. Every time we know a car company will be located in Mexico, do you do any mapping to know the capabilities in place and how demand will increase in each one of the logistic nodes? I understand there is investment, we saw that. They are very interesting projects. However, every time we do some study for some expansion project for a manufacturing plant, we have to go to the detail. What is the point of origin? What is the point of destination? How we will be moving around? And another important aspect to make a decision in case of an expansion is to know if the infrastructure has the necessary capacity, or if when we are ready with the expansion, that capacity will be available or not with the right infrastructure. Question number 2. Personally, I have been in those crossroads, not to know what to tell the corporation and how to conduct an analysis. Can you give us your contact information? Who can we contact in the government in some specific cases? Well, I believe the idea of having this national system of logistic platforms done together with the private sector, the idea is to start planning through networks. What we have seen, and I believe it is not only a mistake in Mexico, but I have seen this happened. This has happened elsewhere. Sometimes we see transportation projects in an isolated manner. This is selfish because we are not including everything which is being done for other projects in transportation. One of the plans we have is truly to initiate as the technical arm of our agency to carry out models for the national demand. Also, here we have had the participation of the Mexican Transportation Institute, who's doing this task through network digitalization. The National Logistic Platform System also gives us a network. What we are trying is to see the implementation to improve not only having a map, but also to have a model for supply and demand which belongs to the country in regards to each specific sector. We cannot be mixing the urban and the cargo, which are different, except there is urban logistics. What I mean is this has not been done. Undoubtedly, whenever we have a rail project. Also, the rail concessionary offering the service with the information they have and with the companies that have got close to them, they ask us to study a type of project that could be improved. There is a limiting factor. Rail concessions, for example, always have been established to operate the infrastructure, not to develop the infrastructure, because we cannot leave one zone for a company entirely. Sometimes this is a misunderstanding. They're geographic monopolies or trusts. It is not so. We have the authority to build a way outside of the concession right of way. The zone is not concession, but only the right of way. We cannot grant it directly to a company. It has to be done through a call for bids. What if this truncal corridor is closer to another area because the land was less expensive, so the plant was established there? Then they will require also the connection with the existing railroad tracks. And then this is benefiting the plant, so the social part of it is not there. So you can get in touch with me. If you're going to have an expansion plan, well, do it outside of urban areas and close to other concessionaries, and this is the formula for competitive logistics, and as close as possible to the rail tracks. I hope I answered your question.
And I believe we will get copies of the presentation to distribute for everybody, as mentioned. So perhaps, I don't know, there's contact details on there as well. I think that's where we're going to leave the Q&A here. Obviously, there's a lot of detail, a lot of things to discuss running up and down the country and all these different corridors. I do want to thank both of our panelists again for their time and contribution today. I'm going to pass the mic over to a moment to my younger and more informed colleague Louis Yakumi about the next steps of the conference. See twins, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Louis now. Chris has actually moved, so now I'm Louis, in case you can't tell the difference. Because of this fantastic session, which was a bit of a surprise to us and to them as much as anybody, we've cancelled the round tables because I think these were two of the most important presentations that you can possibly have at an automotive or at any logistics conference in Mexico. So we've cancelled the round tables. We're now going to have a coffee break, and please join us for the last session at 3:30, where we have three important car makers in a panel discussion: Ford, General Motors, and Nissan. So enjoy your coffee and join us back in about 30 minutes. Thank you.